Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 26th of September. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's urgent CEC report, Australia is under terror threat from an imperial secret police apparatus intent on keeping us at war. And the world needs a new security architecture. So first, the feature of this week's CEC report is a very important expose we have just put out to intervene in the hysteria that is rising in Australia at the moment, Craig, about terrorism. And we've headlined this section, Australia is under terror threat from an imperial secret police apparatus intent on keeping us at war. So we have just released this flyer for distribution around the country, and its headline, British SIS/ASIO planning a terrorist attack on Australia, ? Which, needless to say, is explosive. What we're implying there, well, more than implying.
Robbie, it's also coming in the context that we don't make these questions lightly. If people go back to what we put out in 2002,
yep.
That's 12 years ago now, Robbie. We put a New Citizen out calling Facing the Depression, a fascist police state or economic development,
yeah.
Which I wanted to mention early up because in that paper we go through pretty much the same scenario that we as Australians are facing today with exactly the same laws, right, that are causing the sorts of terror themselves in the population.
Yep.
That were brought in the post 9/11 period.
This is definitely,
this is not
for those with a long enough memory, this is definitely a replay of what happened back then.
A replay and an extension. There's been no let up in this for these 12 years. We haven't seen the economic development necessary like we're seeing particularly in China and India and other places of the world. And consequently what is happening is with the collapse of the financial system globally that we talk about consistently on this program, what we are seeing is a desperate government as part of the British Empire's ruling government putting into place police measures in order to control populations, and everything else is a cover story.
And Craig, we use the word government. What we're talking about also specifically is something that gets to exercise the power of government, but actually we're not talking about the elected government, Tony Abbott. These guys just become pawns in this. There's a permanent secret government, secret police apparatus that runs countries like Australia, Britain, all the British type countries that runs them, and even the United States to a degree, except theirs has slightly more transparency through the Congress. It's far less in our countries, and this is, off the leash. And I wanted to read the opening paragraph of this flyer just so the viewers understand what we're saying, and they can get the details of this off our website. So the opening paragraph says, as things presently stand, a near-term terrorist attack upon Australian soil is almost guaranteed. Why? Is it because there are so many terrorists out there, whether homegrown or returning from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan or elsewhere, such that at least one lone wolf is bound to slip through? No. It is because the British Crown and City of London, which control the British and Australian intelligence services, intend for such an attack to occur. And right on cue, legislation is now pending in the Australian Parliament which will grant virtual immunity to any Australian officials who orchestrate or participate in such an attack. And that's the part that's particularly, that people should be afraid of.
In fact, the legislation, the first part of it went through last night, Robbie.
That's right. So as of last night, you can be jailed for 10 years for exposing an ASIO agent, and you can be jailed for reporting on an ASIO operation, right? The other things they want to pass is immunity from prosecution for ASIO officers and ASIO affiliates. And that ASIO affiliates is a new term, Craig, that's just been injected into the security legislation in Australia, which has got a lot of experts worried because it can include private contractors and it can include foreign spies. So if you have heard George Brandis talk about, to try and placate Senator David Leyonhjelm's concern about torture, we don't torture in Australia. Well, don't close your eyes to the fact of how much torture has gone on in at the hands of Western powers in the last 12-year period since September 11, 2001, which was contracted out to countries where torture was legal and allowed to happen, right? These types of things.
Rendition.
That's right. They called it rendition. So these are, there's loopholes that are permanently built into this, so that these agencies can not go rogue, be rogue in terms of the way we think about it, and that's what we're documenting here as something that people should be afraid of. Because once you establish that permanent secret police apparatus, and with laws that keep it secret and are out of any accountability to any democratic controls in your country, you've gone down a path which you're not going to easily return from. And what's the motive here? Well, there's a war quest. Craig, you've alluded to it, but I just want to elaborate on the replay of 2003 idea. Post the Iraq War and the discovery there was no weapons of mass destruction, the Australian people, the British people, the European people, the American people, they all, eventually wised up and thought this was rubbish. What we were sold was rubbish. And if you paid attention, the terrorist attack, which we talked about here, the actual attack, 9/11, was an inside job, an obvious inside job. We've documented how the funding came via the Saudis, which is a British client state, Saudi Arabia, right? And it's when you talk about, if you want to be afraid of Muslims and is Muslim fundamentalism, it means the most fundamentalist Muslim state in the world, yet it's our unquestionable ally. And they provided the funding to create the circumstances where an agenda that people like Tony Blair in the UK had been hatching since 1999 of allowing the Anglo-American powers to say, well, because of who we are, we reserve the right to topple governments at will. They call it regime change, right? And we have the right to do preemptive strikes to do that. Preemptive strikes which had been made illegal after World War II, because that's how Hitler started World War II, with the argument of we need to do preventive war, that type of thing. And they just took the terrorist attack to twist it, to turn it into a war agenda that they already had, right? And that is the replay now, driven by the fact that the powers that are pushing this are losing the economic basis of their power, which is the transatlantic London Wall Street financial system, right? It's going down the gurgler really fast. So, people have to keep that big picture in mind to sort of see through what we're talking about. So what I want to do, Craig, I want to take a break now. When we come back, we'll go through some of the specific predicates of this flyer, especially highlighting the relationship between ASIO in Australia and MI5 in London and why that should worry people. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we are discussing the subject, Australia is under terror threat from an imperial secret police apparatus intent on keeping us at war. So, Craig, as we discussed before the break, we've issued this flyer to expose to the average Australian that what the hysteria about terrorism that they're currently being bombarded with has a political motivation, right? And it's war and a fascist police state. And we talked about the laws that are being passed in our name before the break. Specifically
to deal with, Robbie, the fact that the global financial system that we've talked about a lot in this program is in a process of rapid disintegration.
Yep.
And it's very interesting when you look at how much coverage there is on the actual G20 or anything like that, and the discussions that are going on, there's just about nothing that hasn't been shrouded by this terrorism issue right now, and that's telling in and of itself.
And one of the reasons, Craig, that there's a general need for a police state, of course, when you have economic meltdown, ordinary people start becoming antsy. Ordinary people are at risk of rising up and saying, we've got to do something about this. And in fact, people have probably heard over the last few years about the austerity in Europe, and there was lots of riots and whatever. There are documented cases where the crackdown on those rioters in places like Greece used laws that were passed post 9/11 in the name of fighting terrorism, right, to actually crack down on the population. So that's a general thing. What we're trying to blow the whistle on is this secret police apparatus that we're establishing in Australia. And what this documents is the relationship between ASIO and MI5. Now, MI5 is part of the British SIS, Secret Intelligence Service. And what might shock people is that it does not answer to the British government per se, the elected British government. MI5 doesn't answer to them. MI5 answers to the Crown, and only the Crown, right? Now, the Prime Minister plays a role in that purely as the Prime Minister, no one else in the Cabinet, no one else in the Parliament. The Prime Minister plays a role in, and on behalf of the Crown can decide what's made public or not, or participate in deciding what's made public or not. But then in some cases, such as when we had our terrorism threat raised here 2 weeks ago, right, by ASIO, that for no reason, ASIO said, well, there's not a particular threat, so why were they doing it? Well, MI5 had done it in London 2 weeks earlier. That part of MI5 that had raised the threat, that doesn't even answer to the Prime Minister. That is answerable to no one in the government structure. They just raised the threat in the lead up to the NATO summit. Now, ASIO was set up in the early 1950s, Craig, and that was in the Cold War, and people might remember the Petrov affair and whatever. But from the outset, ASIO always called MI5 head office, right? That's the relationship that this organisation in Australia has. Now, what people have to understand is when we talk about ASIO, don't confuse ASIO with the police. No. They're not the state. They're not the same as the state police or the Australian Federal Police. And arguably, there are aspects of the police forces that probably have too much power and abuse it. But at least the police forces are answerable to the governments in where they operate. ASIO is not. But ASIO gets to deploy those police forces as part of its operations. Now, why is this so important? Not just because of the unaccountability factor. It's so important because under MI5's regime in England, for decades, London has actively harboured the world's worst terrorists and terrorist organisations. Harboured them, right? That's the word, harboured. Given them actual protection against their governments that have wanted to hold them accountable. And there's a book that's been written because, you know, the guy decapitating people for ISIS there, there's no accident that he's a POM, right? Got a Pommy accent. This is something that's been incubating in London for a long time.
So just let me draw something out here, Robbie, because what you just said, for the benefit of our viewers, is that MI5 is only answerable to the Crown. So this idea of harbouring terrorists and so forth is a policy of the Crown.
Exactly.
It's a strategic policy.
It's a strategic policy.
Why?
Well,
maybe you can explain that. I mean, I know why, but I think it's important to elaborate that for our viewers.
Because what the Crown wants to do is undermine the actual development of nation states. Developing nation states, wherever they are a threat to the Anglo-American hegemony of the world, right?
Which we've talked about a lot on this program.
Exactly.
About the nature of the fight is actually an issue of sovereignty versus this imperial Anglo-American British Empire dominated system that we have today.
And if you can run dirty tricks operations inside a country that undermine the way that country can operate, and you can create the kind of, well, look, take Syria for instance, right? Syria is a target because it's an ally of Russia and because it hosts the world's biggest Russian naval base outside of Russia. So it was the next target in the agenda of regime change. So they create an insurrection inside Syria. We're told that they're moderate Syrians, resisting this monster, Assad, etc. These guys, I feel sorry, Craig, I feel dreadfully sorry for the poor Americans and Brits who got beheaded, because they thought they went over there. I think they must have believed the propaganda. They go to Syria thinking that the people against Assad are moderate and great, right? And we're on their side. They go there, and in one case, those people kidnapped them and sold them to ISIS, and they ended up being beheaded, right? So it's things like that. But it's the London role in this as a strategic policy. But just to document how extensive this has become. So there was a book written in 2006 called The Suicide Factory, Abu Hamza and the Finsbury Park Mosque, that reports that at one point terror suspects living in Britain were wanted, quote, by over a dozen friendly governments. Among these, Russia claims prominent Chechens who helped organise the bombings on civilian targets in Moscow are sheltering in London. The Indian, Pakistani, Sri Lankan, Israeli and Turkish authorities, together with half a dozen European allies and the US government, have all presented Whitehall with lists of suspects they want to put on trial, but all of them are still waiting. The prominent French judge Jean-Louis Bruguière was so appalled by Britain's attitude that he talked of Londonistan as being the city of choice as a safe haven for Islamic terrorists and a place full of hatred. Now, Craig, you'll probably remember in 1998 we demonstrated outside the British consulate in Melbourne here, because it was in the wake of what's called the Luxor massacre, which we tend to forget these pre-9/11 events. 65 tourists were massacred in Egypt by a terrorist organisation called Islamic Group that was headquartered in London, and its leaders in London had all been convicted of murder in Egypt, but they were given asylum in London, and the Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, was ballistic about it. But that was one example of how this works, and we demonstrated to say that Britain should stop harbouring terrorists. Osama bin Laden was able to live in London during the 90s while the Americans were looking for him, right, as part of this arrangement. And then you come back to Australia, because we've also, in this flyer, highlighted as a case study, 2 examples. Khalid Sharif, who went to Syria and held up the severed heads with his sons. Everyone saw that picture. He was known to ASIO. Not just was he known, he'd been convicted of terrorism and served time for terrorism. So he was very well known to ASIO, yet he was able to flee Australia on his brother's passport. And this guy is described as pretty dumb, by the way. And then a few months later, ASIO allowed his wife and son to travel to Syria and join him, right? And of course, then we get the shocking pictures, and it's like, oh, this is just the lone wolf slipping through. No, it's not. Even this young guy here in Melbourne the other night, Craig, you know, it's shocking, and who knows what we're being told. But what does stick out to you is ASIO has known of him well in advance of this. This is not just something that just erupts out of. They're not really lone wolves in that sense. They're already known to this security apparatus. And then there's the case of Hizb ut-Tahrir. And Hizb ut-Tahrir was this organisation that shocked us all in 2012 when the Benghazi terror attack happened at the US consulate in Libya on September 11 that year, because they rallied about this video insulting the Prophet Muhammad. And at the rally in Sydney, there were kids holding up signs, behead those who insult the Prophet. And everyone said, well, what is this organisation? Well, this is an organisation that had been banned in virtually every country in the world except the UK. And in Australia, it hasn't been banned because when the Premier of New South Wales asked ASIO to ban it, they said, no, well, it's not banned in the UK.
Morris Yema, wasn't it?
Morris Yema,
right.
Back in 2007, had asked for it to be banned. No, it's not banned in the UK, so we're not going to ban it here. Yeah. And this is the type of organisation, they don't go and do terrorism themselves per se, but they recruit young people, right, and radicalise them so that then they become that. So anyway, and that follows on from the press release we put out a few weeks ago called British Oligarchy Planning New 9/11 to Trigger World War III, which we discussed at the time. People should get this off our website, read the details on it, and distribute it widely, because we cannot allow this kind of dirty tricks, secret police apparatus to operate in Australia. And the more it's known, then the less it can get away with.
It's shining us very strong light on this. Yep.
Yep. All right, so we've spent a lot of time on that. We'll take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about the optimistic side of the world's future. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, the world needs a new security architecture anchored on collaborative economic development. Craig, Helga LaRouche, the wife of Lyndon LaRouche, the American economist that we work with, she has just issued a call for an urgent conference, and she says this, quote, "We immediately need a global emergency conference with only a single theme. How should a global inclusive security architecture be designed which guarantees the existence and security of all nations on the planet?" And that is precisely worded because she's talking about we cannot have a security regime that's governed by Anglo-American interest.
Well, here in Australia, Robbie, what you have is this constant wall-to-wall discussion about terrorism, about these horrible things, which is terrifying the population. What people don't know, because this is all coordinated through the mass media, it's a coordinated campaign, is that there's other parts of the world where there's tremendous optimism about what can be done for the plight of mankind, and that's actually centred in China and in India, and to some degree Russia as well. Or, with Russia and China always vilified by the British establishment, by the Crown in particular. So, I mean, what Helga's coming out is again, internationally from our position saying, look, there is a counter-position, right? And this is actually not, it's not actually as remote as people would think, because it takes its form in the forms of these BRICS countries, which is, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, which are forming together to create a new financial architecture, right, which is opposing this Anglo-American financial structure that's disintegrated.
But also what she's highlighting is what they're working together on is what will benefit us all. Yeah. It will benefit us all. So she's highlighted the recent China-India economic agreement, and she contrasts it to the Scottish referendum, which was narrowly voted down at the distinct pleasure of the Queen, who purred down the line, "Oh, I'm very pleased." If you saw that, David Cameron put his foot in it apparently. But Helga's point was that did demonstrate the anger that's in the populations of the US and Europe, and we would argue Australia, at the way that people are getting treated by the establishment policies which were in favour of the super rich and permanent wars. And then she talks about, quote, "In stark contrast, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi are proceeding to build an alternative economic system and have declared themselves optimistic, noting that China and India together account for 35% of the human race and are together writing the screenplay for the future."
And the BRICS countries included, Robbie, is over 50% of the human race.
Now, so let's highlight one specific thing that's just happened, Craig, in case people missed it, because it's actually very exciting. This last week, India's space agency successfully placed a craft in orbit around Mars on its first attempt, which is quite an accomplishment. And the Prime Minister of India, Modi, he gave an uplifting speech that's actually being compared to JFK's "We Choose to Go to the Moon." I'll just highlight one part of it. He described it as a national pride event. Referencing the spacecraft's 650 million kilometre trip to Mars, Modi said, "We have gone beyond the boundaries of human enterprise and imagination. We have navigated our craft through a route known to very few. The success of our space program is a shining symbol of what we are capable of as a nation. Let us push our boundaries and then push some more, push more. Let today's success drive us with even greater vigour and conviction. Let's set ourselves even more challenging goals. This too must become a basis for challenging the next frontier." So, Craig, just for the benefit of the viewers and the time we've got left, how do breakthroughs like this in space benefit us on Earth, and why is this the basis for peace?
Both India and China have large populations, Robbie, of very poor people. They know that under the existing regime of technologies, they can't solve the problems necessary with the current energy levels. Yeah. The only way that you can solve it is to make new breakthroughs in new physical principles, push the boundaries of science to come up with new discoveries that create new levels of energy flux density, which is concentrated energy levels that can be applied to the economy to lift out more and more people as quick as possible. They know this principle. This is the principle that is well known in physical economy of how you actually develop a nation. You push the boundaries. Yep. You push human creativity. And that's what's being reflected here.
And when you uplift populations like that in real physical living standards, there's less, impulse for the kind of animosity that leads to
And it's
wars.
highly optimistic.
All right, well, as usual, we're out of time. This has been a very important CEC report. Share it widely. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more.